Welcome back to How Will It End? Today, we'll be showing you 2 episodes from the first season of the TV show, The Stand, which is set in a world plagued by a virus that kills the majority of the living population. And now, survivors must strive to rebuild. Leave your predictions below on how this one plays out. Now, let's see how it ends. Episode 1. The episode starts with Harold entering a church with a group of other men who are there to pack up the bodies of those who had died there after being exposed to a deadly virus that killed a large number of the entire population. At the sight of this, Harold gets irritated and goes out to vomit, and while he's at it, the leader of the group comes over to offer him encouraging words about how feeling irritated at the sight of dead bodies is normal. Just as the man leaves, Harold takes his thoughts back to the past when cases of the virus had just surfaced. He's on his bike headed somewhere when he stops by the house of a girl named Franny, peeping through her hole and watching her as she helps her father who happens to have caught the virus. Franny insists that her father goes into rest, and he agrees, with both of them not knowing that someone was watching them. Almost immediately, Harold is attacked by 2 guys who call him several names for spying on Franny. Harold tries to justify what he was doing, but the boys are not interested. And just before they can get a proper hold of him, Harold gets on his bike and rides away to escape. The boys still chase him, and quite unfortunately, his bike stumbles on a rock and he falls to the ground. At this point, the bullies can only record and threaten him before eventually leaving. Harold picks himself up, looking bruised, and he drags his bike home. When he gets there, he checks the mail and finds the one he's looking for, though it turns out to be a rejection mail. He looks devastated at this as he walks across the room. He greets his mom, who's very sick and can barely talk. As he's headed to his room, his sister, Amy, also has some words for him, though she's particularly unhappy about her bridal shower receiving no guests because everyone was sick. When Harold enters his room, he sticks his rejection letter on the wall that has some other old ones, after which he goes to get himself cleaned up. Elsewhere, a man named Stu is in a containment facility where he's being monitored by special forces and a doctor named Jim. As it turns out, Stu had come in contact with the man who had first gotten the virus from a bio-research facility. Jim tells Stu that he's being monitored to see what made him survive because everyone else who came in contact with the man, Campion, had died. This surprises Stu, as he remembers very well that he was the one who carried Campion out of the car after he had apparently driven the car into a pole because he was already seriously infected and lost control, with his wife and kid also found dead in the car. Stu agrees to be used as a test subject to find a cure, and immediately, Jim calls a nurse to come and take some samples off Stu. Days later, Harold rides his bike around town, only to see that everywhere is scanty and he was the only one still alive. He goes to Franny's house and sees her also alive, digging aside on her dad's farm. He gets her attention and sounds so relieved to talk to her. She tells him she's about to bury her dad, and after his poor attempts at making jokes about death, she asks him to leave even though he asks to help her. She insists that she's no longer his babysitter, which she did along with being Amy's friend. Out of anger, Harold walks off and tells her no one is coming and they need each other. After Harold leaves, Franny goes into the house, and after a battle to get her dad downstairs, she eventually buries him. Later that night, Franny has a nightmare where she would eventually see a woman named Abigail who asks Franny to come and see her at a nursing home in Colorado. It feels so real when Franny wakes up, and as she looks out the window, it's all dark except for the light coming from Harold's house, where he is using a typewriter to type out his plan for what he wants to do next. Elsewhere, Stu suddenly gets informed that the containment facility has been compromised because someone there already has the virus, and now he'd been moved to a new location led by a soldier named Dr. Cobb. Cobb doesn't sound exactly friendly on the way, as he insists for Stu to cover his face with a mask because they were headed to a classified location. Though Stu wonders why things are still classified in a world with only few survivors. When they get there, Jim joins Stu inside and tells him that the place is controlled by a general who opens the doors to a control room and that Stu has to keep cooperating with Cobb so they don't have to be forceful with him. Back in the city, Harold goes to see Franny and meets her in a depressed state after she had attempted to kill herself by ingesting many pills. This time, he consoles her by telling her of his plan to go to the CDC, as well as help in finding a cure since they were immune. Franny agrees, calling it a good plan, before then resting her head on Harold's shoulder, which makes him happy. After packing their things and getting prepared, Harold sprays a message on the wall to let any other survivor know where they're headed. With that, he and Franny soon leave the town. Things take a wrong turn in Stu's new location after he has a strange dream where he sees a wolf. While he is contemplating what the dream is about, Jim comes in looking pale and saying he's now infected. He goes further and tells Stu that Cobb and nearly everyone there had either died or gotten infected, as he laments at his predicament, and saying he'll slit his own throat to die faster. Cobb comes in with a gun, threatening to kill Stu, in a bid to follow his orders until the end to prevent Stu from knowing where the classified location is. As Jim tries to stop Cobb, he gets killed in the process, but Stu manages to kill Cobb immediately, after which he then hears a series of commands from the general, giving him directions to the control room. When Stu gets there, the general mentions that Cobb was only following orders. He also talks about setting Stu free, and as it turns out, the general had also been infected, and to avoid suffering and pain until he dies, he ends up shooting himself to die on his own terms. With that, Stu is able to head out after following the instructions of the general in search of survivors. Back to the present, Harold saves one of his fellow workers at the excavation site from falling to his death, and he also has to make a decision about whether to stick with his old image of being an outcast or to create a new one where he can be treated like he deserves. He also has a dream where he first sees a wolf and then a man who offers him a shiny bead-like object. But before he can do anything, he wakes up. The next day, while he's out, he bumps into a pregnant Franny who is also with her spouse, Stu. And despite acting friendly with them, Harold lashes out at himself when he gets home, prompting him to focus on his typing and mention that he now has a plan to kill Stu and maybe Franny as well. As it turns out, the spread of the virus had started from Campion's facility, and as he planned to escape with his wife and kid in the car, a man named Flag appears in the backseat, smiling at Campion. Episode 2. Back in another survivor's camp, a lady named Nadine stares at a shiny bead just before a guy named Larry comes into her tent and tells her, and the kid with them, Joe, that they need to meet the other survivors in the general camp. They soon set out, along with some other people, and just as they arrive, Stu asks for Larry, and he introduces himself, with Stu then saying they've been waiting for him. As it turns out, Larry had been one of the survivors from New York, where he was a successful singer. However, his past is filled with disappointment, as it seems to be all his mom sees in him, even despite being a good singer. Eventually, she dies due to the virus infection, and in his search for survivors, he meets Rita, and they immediately form a strong connection that sees Rita take him to her house, after which they spend some quality time together. Eventually, they agree to look for others, but things don't turn out too well for them when they're ambushed by a group of men who insist that they want Rita. Larry and Rita have to go separate ways after they argue about escaping through a sewer, but eventually they meet at the exit after Larry has a strange encounter with what appears to be his mother's ghost in the sewer. Elsewhere, a guy named Lloyd and his friend rob a store, and things go pretty wrong fast, with Lloyd's friend killing a cop, though Lloyd gets blamed for it after his friend's death. He is sentenced to jail, and there, he watches as the virus outbreak takes over the prison, with Lloyd even having to eat a mouse and part of his dead cellmate's leg. Back to the present, Larry joins Stu to go and see Abigail, and on their way, Larry says she was the one who directed him there through his dream. Stu says the same thing, and that he and Larry are just 2 of the 5 people that Abigail chose to run the place. They eventually get to Abigail's place, and there, Larry meets a cop named Ray before then going to meet Nick, who then takes him to see Mother Abigail, who says she's been waiting for Larry. Elsewhere, Nadine and Joe are with Franny as they walk. Nadine talks about how Joe is not her child and she only saw him stranded and named him Joe since he didn't say anything. She also says she was a teacher, and Franny says she'll be helpful for the new community they want to build. Franny also talks about how Abigail summoned her with dreams, before then asking Nadine if she can take responsibility for Joe as his mother. Without much hesitation, Nadine agrees. Much later that day, Larry gets to meet Nadine in their assigned apartment, and she doesn't seem happy that Larry won't share what Abigail told him. She eventually tells Larry to take Joe on a walk, and they soon leave her at home, with Larry then going to see Harold to thank him for the signs he left on the road, as it was what helped him and pushed him to keep going. Harold is surprised at how highly Larry thinks of him, and he also receives a gift from Larry, though Joe seemingly refuses to say hello to him. Larry also asks about Franny, and when he notices that Harold doesn't want to talk about it, he says he understands because he had also met someone, but things didn't work out. Back at the apartment, Nadine sees something shaking inside a box on a shelf, and she has to bring it down to examine it. Meanwhile, Lloyd happens to get saved by Flag, who shows up and tells Lloyd he wants him to be his second in command, and as long as Lloyd promises to do as Flag says, he'll free him. As he's pretty desperate and really hungry, having been locked in a cell for a long time, he accepts, despite seeing Flag do some suspicious magic tricks that also sees a key he's handed turn to a shiny bead. Following this, Flag lets him out, and together, they head over to get something to eat. And that is how it ended. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. And if you would like to give this a watch for yourself and support the movie, we always link it in the description below to save you the trouble. Thanks for watching.